Welcome back to another episode of the Petey Performance Podcast. Another solo episode for you guys this week, and it will be another brief one. I got some good reports and good feedback regarding last week's podcast about in-season strength and conditioning. So I said I'd put up another question box and see what people came back with as topics to cover in this week's pod. And the two overarching themes that came from that question box and the answers that I received were people were interested then to know what would I do in both an off-season program for a GAA player or a pre-season program for a GAA player. So I thought, given the time of year, it's probably more appropriate for me to cover off-season training than it would be to cover pre-season. I will potentially cover pre-season early next year. I think that would be the best timing for that for everyone, maybe pre-season or during the off-season. But lots of people are wondering, when am I going to get back to training? When should I get back to training? What should my training look like when I do get back to training? And how much do I have to do to retain the qualities I've worked on over the season? But not only that, to improve upon those qualities as well. Now, I'm lucky enough at the moment that I am not entering the off-season with my athletes because they are still in the championship. It is a championship week for our ladies. The first ever senior championship final for Thomas Davis senior ladies football team, which is a monumental achievement, but we'll be hoping to go one better than that and go and get some county medals. So exciting week ahead. That's on Friday at 7:30, and it will be live on Dubs TV for anybody that's interested. We're playing Kilmacud Crokes in that. We've already played them twice this year, I think. Quite a strong outfit. I know a couple of the ladies on the Crokes team as well, and I'll be wishing them the best of luck, but hopefully we can come out the other side with a win. But hopefully we can put a performance together as the number one, and then the outcome we can't really control. So as I've spoken about before, if you give absolutely everything on that field and you empty yourself and you do everything in the build-up that you possibly can, then at the end of the game, if the result doesn't go your way, you will be at least more comfortable in knowing that you couldn't have done anything else. You did your absolute best. You gave your absolute best. And unfortunately, the outcome didn't go your way. And equally, I know that sometimes you can be focused too much on the performance and people might see that as an excuse. But I have seen in the past a lot of managers when they've won titles, Alex Ferguson, most notably with Aberdeen. If you haven't seen that interview after they won the league or the cup, could have been the Scottish Cup, and he gave an interview immediately afterwards, and he just absolutely ripped into the players. Even though they won, he was not happy with the performance and he demanded a lot more. And that is said to be one of the factors, that interview, in him getting the Manchester United job. So if you haven't seen that, I would recommend having a little YouTube search of it and have a little look at it. And it is a testament to Alex Ferguson and the standards that he drives. Now, he did apologize for it afterwards. A couple of months after, said he was a little bit over the top, but that's what you're trying to do. You're trying to reach the highest level of performance for each athlete and the team. So it's not completely results orientated, but at the same time, if you reach for that higher level of performance and you don't quite get there, but you still win, then that's still a positive, I suppose. So they're playing Crokes in the semi or in the final, and the senior men are out in 2 weeks against Kilmacud Crokes as well in the senior championship semi-final. So it's all go at the moment, but I've put aside some time this morning to record this podcast for you on something that will hopefully be beneficial for those that are not lucky enough to still be in the championship, who may be taking their couple of weeks off now to relax, enjoy themselves a little bit, and recover, and then hopefully tuck into some off-season training in the coming weeks. So the first question that's often asked is, how long should I take off? And I think the answer to this question is highly individual, because it is not based on arbitrary physical performance metrics. Obviously, you don't want to go a huge amount of time before you get back into your training. But at the same time, there's no point in getting stuck into your training again if you're not mentally ready and recovered and hungry to and have that desire to get back into training again. Because if you start training too early and you're feeling a little bit burnt out and you're not really feeling very motivated to do so, then unfortunately, you're probably not going to get the same results as what you would if you took the extra week off or the extra couple of weeks off and just focused on coming back in a positive frame of mind with high levels of motivation, high levels of motivation to get after it and go achieve some goals and improve your performance. So I would say I recommend for my athletes a minimum of at least 2 weeks off for everybody. If you need to take more than that, you can take more than that. But I would recommend getting back into your training within at least probably 6 weeks of the season finishing, unless you're absolutely banjaxed, would be the clinical term I would use. But no, so no injury will get better really with rest unless you're recovering from maybe surgery or something extremely serious. So if we're going to cause an adaptation and improve our performance, especially in a rehab setting, then we're going to have to load some tissue. So I would even recommend getting back to small bits of training if you can, or rehab, if you would call it rehab, within 6 weeks of the season finishing, but ideally after about 2 weeks, 3 weeks. But do something that you enjoy doing and something that gives you a little bit of a mental boost as well, something that because if you enjoy doing it, you're going to be more likely to do it in the future, and you're more likely to see some gains and see some improvements in regards to doing it as well. So I have had athletes come to me after 7 days, even after a season has finished, hungry to get back into it. And I usually tell them to go away for another week, another 4 or 5 days most. Some athletes back after 10 days wanting to get back into it. And I love that attitude of wanting to get back into it. But typically the athletes that come with that attitude are the same athletes that could probably benefit from taking that full 2 weeks off to mentally recharge and mentally just sit and allow their body to recover as well, because they're typically the type A individuals we were speaking about earlier who might go off the other end of the spectrum in terms of their training intensity and volume at times. They need to be pulled back a little bit more so than pushed. To use a racehorse analogy, you're pulling back on the reins probably more than using the whip with those athletes. So get them to take some time off, and switching off is probably a hard thing to do, especially if the season hasn't gone well. And then when you're coming back into your training, I would say the first thing you need to do is do an audit of what went on last year, your own performance, what were your strengths and what do you feel you need to improve upon. And then that will kind of give you an idea of what you need to do in the off season and what you should be working on in the off season, because you can then set some measurable goals and attainable goals that you can work towards achieving. So it doesn't have to be loads when you get back into it. It's probably useful to touch on the minimums and the maximums that I would suggest for people going into their off season. Number one thing is most Gaelic footballers and hurlers are going to have a couple of niggles coming into the off season after a very long season. Like we're going into week 39, I think, of the season this week. So like it is a long slog and there will be some niggles there. But address those, maybe get in to see a physio or a therapist of some sort, get some sort of a rehab program and focus on that, because your recovery and your regeneration time is going to be a lot better now that you don't have any team pitch sessions or matches to get through. So addressing those issues, imbalances, whatever you want to call them, is probably the number one priority first, because our number one principle is at first do no harm. So first we want to be injury free and ready to push it when we get back into our training. After you've done that, then I would recommend definitely getting back into the gym at least once a week, if not 2 times a week minimum. Athletes come to me and they ask a lot, and they ask, how many times do I need to be in the gym? And I often give the answer, you only need to be in the gym as many sessions as you want to be in the gym, really. Within reason, obviously, as I just touched on, you'll have to get that 1 to 2 sessions in, but you can improve from 2 sessions in the gym as much as you can improve in 5 sessions in the gym. It's the quality of the sessions that is the most important thing. You can split it up into 4 or 5 sessions a week if you want, if you really, really want to. 2 of those probably being high sessions where you're focused on compound lifts, heavy lifts, and really pushing the intensity. And the others would be more low intensity sessions where you'd be focused on recovering from those high sessions, doing more isometrics, doing more lower intensity stuff, some extensive work, med ball, throws, accessory lifts, etc. But 5 sessions a week is probably the maximum I would recommend. If I was to suggest a sweet spot that would probably suit people getting back into training, and I have seen lead to high levels of motivation and buy-in, I would say probably 3 sessions a week is appropriate in the gym. When you go back into the gym as well, I think a lot of people just go straight back into a strength focused program where they might be going just general 5x5, or they might say, right, I need to put on a little bit of muscle, so they go for a straight hypertrophy based program and just go bodybuilding for a couple of months. And there is value in doing both, but I think that there's probably better value in doing some training that is more appropriate to your performance as an athlete in the sport in question. So I would suggest keeping some plyometrics in your training sessions, even in the gym, starting off extensive plyometrics and progressing to more intensive as you go over the season. Like, you could do even basic stuff like pogos, skipping, different variations, different planes of movement. And then you could go more intensive with the pogos as well, and more high volume with them, because you won't have the same load on pitch as you would in the season, during the season. So you can see some decent improvements in your jump, in your reactivity if you do that. As well as that, I would definitely put in some isometrics in the gym as well, which I think are commonly neglected. I would start with yielding isometrics, which basically means you're just holding up your body weight or holding up a weight against gravity. And then only towards the start of preseason or into the preseason would I progress to some overcoming isometrics as a general rule. And they would be when you're pushing against a constant resistance. So pushing against the wall, pushing against a leg press, pushing against an immovable object, essentially. So they will be shorter duration holds of maybe 5 to 10 seconds. And you'll definitely feel the burn on them. And they're very taxing on the central nervous system as well. So if you do a high volume of those in a session, you will feel pretty spent afterwards. Then med ball throws. We would get a few med ball throws done in the season, but not to the same volume. I would say definitely put some med ball throws in, starting extensively, progressing to intensive again. And from general to specific with those exercises, I think they're great as well, because when we go into our lifts, we're going to be going into a phase of what we would call GPP, or general physical preparation, which will be your basic lifts, really nothing too specific at this stage of the season. But from doing those lifts, you will become very proficient in moving through those planes of motion and moving through those movement patterns. But if we get the med ball throws in, then hopefully you'll be able to retain some elements of rotation, a little bit of movement variability within the movements that you're using, which will be more appropriate to what happens on the field, because what happens on the field is chaotic by nature. So I would definitely keep in some med ball throws and some plyos and some isos, as I said. And I try to get to the gym at least 2 to 3 times a week, depending on your desire to get in there and your hunger to improve. If you are lifting in the gym, then I would go to start with a general physical preparation program. I've been asked, should I focus solely on hypertrophy? Should I focus solely on strength? Or should I focus on power? Or can I focus on them all? And you can focus on them all, but you probably need to have a specific goal for each session. And Maybe not each phase, but maybe for each phase as well. It depends. But I would use a vertical integration type model for periodization, which is very fancy lingo, which basically means you're focusing on getting each of those physical qualities trained within your training sessions and your training program, but you are focusing on one of the physical qualities or two max per training session or per training phase. So that would mean that during a training session, if you were trying to touch all of those qualities, you'd have the accessories, the plyos, the med ball throws, etc., that I just spoke about. And you might throw them in at the start of the session. Then you'd move into more power-based or rate of force development based exercises. So that looks like what we're doing in the gym anyway. So you could do maybe some loaded jumps, some Olympic lifts if you were looking to improve in that regard, focused on developing power as such or power output. Then you would go for your strength focus, where you're focused on improving your maximal force output. So that would be your heavy compounds. That could be your squats, your trap bar deadlifts. It could be for upper body. It could be bench. It could be push press, depending on the day. Push press maybe would be more power focused, but you could develop strength there depending on the velocity of the movement. But I would say you probably need a higher velocity on a push press, so that probably wouldn't be appropriate. There's me falling over my words anyway. And then towards the end of the session, you could focus on more hypertrophy and more capacity building exercises, maybe robustness focus. So focused on improving in tissues that would be important in not just maximal outputs and power generation and rate of force development, but also hopefully reducing the risk of injury. So strengthening up the tissues around your shoulder, strengthening up the tissues around your knee, around your hip, etc. So accessory lifts there would be appropriate for high repetition ranges in your lifts. So you could go fairly high rep there. And in the off season, I would go pretty high repetition. I wouldn't initially in the first couple of weeks even necessarily put in many of the power focused exercises or strictly strength focused exercises or rep ranges. I would go with a high rep model for your first 2 to 3, maybe 4 weeks of the off-season program to build a little bit of aerobic conditioning, build a little bit of capacity and a tolerance for high volume training, which you wouldn't be exposed to too frequently during the season in the gym, because we're trying to manage and limit the amount of fatigue that is occurred or incurred on the athlete during the season, so that they can do so on the field of play and on the pitch, because that's a priority. Whereas we don't have that focus at this stage of the season because there's no team sessions, you're not competing in games, you're not competing for selection, etc. So I would go probably high rep. I'd start with very basic when you're just getting back into it, depending on how long you've taken off. But you could go with the old 3x12, 4x12 and progress the volume load by increasing the volume totally. So you could go 3x12 your first week, then go into 4x12, and then you could go 4x15, and then you're increasing the volume load that way, even by keeping the weight that you're lifting the exact same, the load's the same. Or you could just increase the loads progressively. So for example, like if you're using 20 kilo dumbbells the next week, then you do the same exercise, go 22.5 kilo dumbbells. Excuse me. I always have a coffee just before this, and it gives me a little bit of a belch, but maybe I should stop doing that. I have a lovely cold brew this morning. But anyway, moving on. So yeah, so I go pretty high rep on that, and I progress it. But I think in the season, you're not afforded the opportunity to push the level of progression too much for the reasons that I just spoke about, in terms of optimizing your freshness and having less fatigue presented in the players. So I don't think you need to change the program loads week on week at the start of the off season. If you just stick to a fairly basic program for the first 3 weeks, you don't need to change the exercises too much week on week at the start anyway. And not even as you go on either. Like your program shouldn't really change too much in a couple of weeks, maybe a couple of exercises can change in terms of level of progression if you're finding them really easy, or if you've reached a goal in terms of that program, or not that program, in terms of that exercise. So say you were trying to work up to a yielding split squat of a really high volume, like 120 seconds or 150 seconds or something huge, like Jake Toura usually puts in his programs when he's trying to improve jump height, etc., and reactivity. If you hit that on week 2, there's no point in doing that again, really, week 3. So then maybe add a little bit of load and reduce the number of seconds or the duration of the hold. And likewise, if you were doing that on a calf raise, on an isometric calf raise, then you might be able to increase or change the variation that you're using if you find it easy after 1 or 2 weeks. And we'll all be slightly better at some exercises than we will be at others. So I would keep it pretty similar for the first few weeks, high repetition. I think lots of athletes neglect that because they find it quite boring. They don't see it transfer too much to the sport. But again, we're trying to make you an overall better athlete. And we're also trying to improve your tolerance for training at this stage of the season for when the season does come around. So if we improve your capacity, your overall general conditioning, your robustness, and hopefully improve your strength as well, because it will improve slightly even from a high repetition program, then hopefully we can chase those outputs and we can look to improve down the line. So we're building a foundation in the off season more so than anything. Now, one thing I haven't mentioned yet is what you should be doing on the field, which is also key and also important in the off season, because you want to be able to keep up the frequency of training on the field. And like it or not, you're in a running-based sport, so you've got to be able to run. And you all know that I have a bit of a speed bias, so I'm really focused on and see the importance and value on focusing on developing your speed. That may be your maximum speed, your acceleration, and nothing is going to improve by itself if we don't work on it. So I would recommend getting down to the pitch at least once a week, if at all possible. 2 times a week would probably be even more favorable, in my opinion. Now, a lot of people talk about, oh, well, I don't want to burn out from my sport. I still want to have the hunger for it. But you should actually enjoy getting down to the pitch. You should enjoy your sport. So maybe trying to get back to that level of enjoyment will be a very important thing to focus on at this stage of the year. And you might get that enjoyment from training by yourself, or you might get that enjoyment from going down with one of your mates or a few of your teammates and doing it in a group setting and having a little bit more banter and a bit more of a chat, as well as having more of an opportunity to improve your performance and improve your performance metrics, your max speed, your acceleration, your ability to change direction, your conditioning, because you don't have the added stressor of team sessions and the added stressor of matches. So you'll be able to push those outputs a little bit better or higher, because you will have the opportunity to recover from training a little bit more. So you'll recover a little bit quicker, and hopefully you'll be able to get a little bit better as a result. So I would recommend getting down to the pitch probably twice a week. I would suggest, because of training residuals, if you're not aware of training residuals, it's how long does it take for physical quality to drop off if not trained. And because of training residuals, the number one that drops off the quickest is your speed, or your max speed. And that drops off within 5 plus or minus 2 to 3 days, I think it is. So roughly a week. And that's why it's so important to focus on touching max speed weekly in the season, in order to retain that physical quality, and number 2, in order to reduce the risk of injury and posterior chain hamstring injury. So I would recommend doing some speed work in the off season as well. And I would use a short to long approach. So I would start by focusing on some accelerations. Now that could be 20 meters, it could be 30 meters. And you will also have your technical sprinting drills in there that you could start with very general stuff. You could throw in some rudiment hops from Altis. So that would be like your Pogo series, forward hops, backwards hops. And they would hopefully improve your tolerance for loading on the pitch. And something that drops off a lot in athletes that present with, say, tendinopathies is their tolerance for that type of training, and they lose a little bit of that reactivity and a little bit of that spring. So it is very, very important that you try to retain that as best you can, especially if you're someone that suffers from Achilles tendinopathy during the season or patellar tendinopathy. If you don't use it, you lose it essentially. So I would throw them in to warm up. Then maybe some of your technical drills. They can be general at the start, and you will get some benefit from doing general ones. But I do see players often just going through the motions with those exercises, as well as that. Once you get further into the off season, if you're trying to develop your speed, improve your acceleration and improve your speed and your change of direction ability, it probably makes sense to go a little bit more specific with those drills that you're using. So it probably would be a good idea to analyze or get somebody to analyze your running technique and analyze how you could improve and where you need to improve, and then prescribe suitable variations for you to do in your technical drills. You can do that on the same day as when you go down to the pitch. After that, I get your exposure to accelerations and max speed initially in the season, short to long approach, as I said. You will have the benefit, though, as we said, of not having the other stressors in mind during the off season. So you can progress a little bit longer and you can do more reps as well. Now, for a speed session, I wouldn't recommend going more than probably 200 to 300 meters of total sprint volume in the session. Some people advocate going to 350. I don't think it's necessary, especially for Gaelic Games athletes who won't have the same level of exposure to max speed training. I think you can get the same benefits from going a little bit shorter end at the start of the off season and progressing as you go. Now, if you're doing 200 meters and you're doing 20-meter accels, that means you could do 10. I would say you'd need at least 30 seconds recovery time per 10 meters sprinted. So if you're doing 20 meters, that would mean you'd need a full minute in between reps, because if you're going to push max outputs up and max speed up, you need to be fully recovered. So that means when you go into the longer distances of 60 meters, 70 meters, 80 meters, you're going to need 4 or 5 minutes in between reps to actually push those maximal outputs. So you should be bored, really. And that's why it's beneficial to go down with a coach or with some teammates and have a chat in between reps, or even just put a podcast on or some music that you like, and listen to the full song. Try and wrap it off to yourself before you go into your next rep. So that's a mistake that's made a lot, because I see athletes go do sprint training and just do repeated sprints where they're probably sprinting maximally for many, many efforts. Now, after you've done your speed work, which I would recommend hitting at least once a week, but if you're really focused on improving there, I would probably focus on even 2 times a week being exposed to that. You can get down to the pitch as much as you want as well, but I wouldn't see any need to get down there more than 3 times a week. After you've done that, I would go into your conditioning work, which can be aerobic in nature. At the start of the off season, I would say extensive tempo running is probably appropriate, and probably more appropriate than your laps, probably more appropriate than your road running for developing the physical qualities that are necessary for the sports of Gaelic football and hurling. So I would go again with a short to long approach with that. I would start for extensive tempo. That means probably a rolling clock of about 70 to 60 seconds, maybe 80 seconds in between that. But for aerobic work, you want a work to rest ratio of 1:1 or even greater. So you want longer rest than you have working, or equal. But it wouldn't need to be that long as well, because it's not anaerobic. It's not the same as the speed work. So for your extensive tempo, you can run the length of the pitch. That's actually, sorry, I'm thinking rugby pitch because of my rugby background. You could probably run about 80 meters initially, progress that up to 100. Then you could progress it up to 120 at the end. And you're going at about 70% of your max speed. So if you're going, say, 100, 120, that's roughly down to the opposite 21 or to the 45 initially. You should be running to the 45 in about 25 seconds, roughly, I would say. And down to, that's probably actually a little bit too slow, down to the 21 in about 25 seconds. but you might be a little bit shorter going to the 45. You could start at about 20 seconds and then take the rest of the time for the minute for recovery and go back. I would progress the total overall volume that you're covering per week, but at the start, you can just progress it by doing an added rep or an added 2 reps per set of the exercise. So you can break it up whatever way you want. If you've done the speed work already, I would go a little bit more conservative with it, and I'd probably just do 2 reps or 2 sets. You could go 6, 7, 8 repetitions for 2 sets, which are split up by a rest period of about 2 to 4 minutes, and then you rest for 2 to 4 minutes, and then you go again with your next set. If you're not doing the sprint volume, then you can probably go a little bit more aggressive with it and go with 3 sets, but you're probably focused on developing an overall volume that you're covering of no more total than about 2.5 to 3K, I would say, in high speed running volume. So that's the tempo running. So add up the distance you've gone by the number of reps, by the number of sets, and that will give you the volume that you've run. And then you can progress that week on week, and hopefully then you'll have a tolerance, still retain your tolerance, and maybe even improve your tolerance to high speed running volume, which will be very appropriate for Gaelic games, because that is the speed that you run at for a lot of the game, off the ball especially. Excuse me. So after we have addressed that, what I would recommend, which is probably beyond my scope. All the lads are always slagging me because I kick the football like a rugby ball. It doesn't float at all. It just goes dead. So I would recommend getting some skill work in and focus on retaining your tolerance to kicking the ball, because you do see the odd injury from people not being able to keep up the tolerance when you get back to training. As well as that, if you're going to be a better footballer, you want to be better at football. Likewise with hurling, if you want to be a better hurler, you've got to be better at hurling. So you've got to keep up the skill work and hopefully improve in terms of your touch in hurling, in terms of your striking ability, how accurate you are, your free taking ability, etc. And same thing with the football, in your ability to take scores, in your ability to use left foot, right foot. If you have teammates there, you can improve your ability to hand pass. If too many hand passes are going to ground, your catching ability. So that is an essential part of the training that is often neglected as well. And I would recommend getting out at least for every athlete once a week and doing that. So throw that at the end of your high speed running or prior to it, depending on how little or how much you're doing. I also didn't mention, after you've done extensive tempo, I would progress it to intensive tempo, which would mean that you'd shorten the rest time while shortening the distance you're covering per rep as well. But it would also mean you're more efficient doing so, time efficient that is. So you go on a rolling clock of maybe 30 seconds and you'd start with 60, 70, 80 meters covering that distance. And then you could add in a change of direction or a down up or a jump or whatever you want to intensify it further as you're getting towards the end of the off season. But hopefully not burning out and not doing that more than 2 times a week. Skill work then, 1, 2, 3 times a week, whatever you want there. The hurlers I know, they'll be happy to do it 2 or 3 times. They'll go for a few pucks in their spare time whenever they can, because I'm from Tipperary, so it's a way of life. They love hurling, like that's the reason they play the sport. Whereas in other areas, they might become burnt out by the football a little bit more or the hurling a little bit more, so they won't want to do the same volume of skill training as I've seen at home. But it is necessary if you're going to improve, because that's the number one thing, even though that's not the sheer focus of this stage of the season. Okay, so we've covered pretty much everything. The last thing that I want to touch on is body composition, because this is a time in the year that if you're thinking, right, I need to alter my body composition, I need to drop a bit of body fat, this is when it is most appropriate to do so. So this is when it might be appropriate to get into a calorie deficit and track your calories a little bit better, and you won't have to recover and put the same outputs in team sessions. So if you want to drop into a calorie deficit of no more than 400 calories per day, I'd say that's pretty aggressive, to be honest. You could probably go even a little bit less aggressive with it and go 200, 300 calories a day deficit, and look to drop a little bit of body fat, maybe add a little bit of muscle mass as well, by keeping your protein high. So keeping your protein over to 2.2 grams per kg of body weight. That's the time to do it now when you don't have the games. And it's also probably the hardest time to do so too, because you will have the added distractions of the going outs, the nights out, the alcohol consumption. You'll have takeaways, you'll have the food coming for Christmas, selection boxes, etc. But if you do want to improve as an athlete, you have to think of yourself as an athlete. You're a 24-hour athlete, 365. So you need to think about your health. You need to give respect to your health, and you need to maybe take those 2 weeks off to do what you want and do what you enjoy. But you also need to focus on developing the habits that are necessary to retain that level of body composition throughout the season. So it's not solely focused on an aggressive deficit that isn't then sustainable. You have to improve your habits and improve your overall daily living in order to retain that level of body composition throughout the season. Now, with Gaelic footballers and hurlers, sometimes they can be focused on getting their body fat level a little bit too low, and it won't impact that positively on the game to an extent. But I would say that the research says that intercounty footballers are between 10 and 12% anyway. So once you get down there, it's not going to make that much of a difference if you drop into 9% body fat, 8% body fat, other than maybe to your head and to how you're feeling about yourself. But definitely don't be underfueled for your training sessions, because you're not going to be able to improve your actual performance at the physical qualities that are attributable, is that a word, to the sport. Okay, so I would say if you're at 15%, 16%, 14%, you want to drop down a couple of body fat percentages because you think it will improve your ability to get around the field, by all means do so, but don't get too caught up in it. I would chase the physical outputs first and just keep on top of your habits, on top of your nutrition, and don't go on the piss more than once a week in the off season if you can. And then I would hope that by improving the physical performance, adding a little bit of muscle mass and adding a little bit of strength, etc., and your output still being high, you may in fact have a drop in your body fat percentage as a result anyway. But if you do want to improve and reduce your body composition or your body fat levels or percentages, then by all means do so. This is the time to do so. Don't say you'll do so in pre-season or during the season, because it'll take away from your training and you won't be able to train at the same level as is necessary to improve your performance, get your place on the team, and improve on match days. And you won't have time to focus on improving the habits during the season that are sustainable for the rest of the year, because you'll have lots of other stressors. So that would be what I would suggest for the off season. If you are interested in improving any of those qualities or need a little bit of a hand with doing so, I am available for individualized premium level online coaching. I only have a certain number of spots for that, so please get in touch with me as soon as possible, because I like to give an individualized approach. I like to make myself available to the athletes, and I like to be a little bit reactive in the programming. As I always say, we want to be proactive as well as reactive, so we can change the program if necessary. So obviously that's a time-consuming process for me, so that's why I have limited spots available there. I also have the off-season GAA strength and conditioning subscription, which will be a progressive program that will be given to all members of that program. That would be probably a little bit better than just going off and doing your own thing as well, but it's obviously at a little bit of a lower price point. Still great value in that product, but it's probably more suitable for your students, for your younger athletes who mightn't have the same level of income to give out to a coach that will be able to give them the individualized programming, online programming. And I'm doing in-person speed and change direction sessions with people starting from this week as well. So if you're interested in that, feel free to get in touch. Other than that, we're going to have guests for next week. So if you're sick of listening to me, then that's 100%, because we're going to have more guests focused on GAA next week. I have an intercounty strength and conditioning coach performance coach coming on. So that should be an interesting one. And I hope you've taken something from this conversation. If you have enjoyed it and you feel somebody else would enjoy it, please remember to like it, share it, and send it. Okay, Petey out. Have a good one. Hopefully I'm back to you next week with a championship medal in the back pocket, as they say. But hope you're all enjoying the off season as well as focused on getting back to it and back to improving yourself. And if you need me, you know where I am.